That's exactly how I felt when I first met Brad Williams, and trust me, that feeling only got worse from there. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 39 years old, and I run an electrical contracting business that I've been building for the past 15 years. 2 years ago, I inherited my grandfather's house in Oakmont Ridge, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest drama was supposed to be someone parking their garbage cans on the wrong day. Boy, was I wrong about that. My wife Diana and I moved into the house with big dreams. She works as a freelance bookkeeper, always buried in spreadsheets and tax documents, handling clients from her perfectly organized home office. I thought we'd found our slice of the American dream: white picket fence, friendly neighbors, maybe even get to know the local HOA president and contribute to community events. What I didn't expect was for that HOA president to hate my guts the moment she laid eyes on me. Patricia Williams became our neighborhood's HOA president just 6 months ago, and from day one, she treated me like I'd personally insulted her entire family tree. But it wasn't Patricia who made my skin crawl, it was her son. Brad Williams, 25 years old, worked part-time helping his mother with HOA compliance, whatever that meant. The first time I saw this kid, I swear my heart skipped a beat, and not in a good way. Have you ever seen someone and felt like you were looking in a mirror from 20 years ago? That's exactly what happened when Brad walked up my driveway to document my first violation. He moved exactly like me. Same confident stride, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking, same stubborn chin that my ex-girlfriends used to complain about. Even his hand gestures, when he explained things, were identical to mine. The violation itself was ridiculous. My work truck was improperly parked, according to some obscure HOA rule I'd never heard of. But what really got to me was how professionally Brad documented everything. This wasn't some kid with a smartphone taking pictures. He had professional photography equipment, measured distances with precision tools, and filled out forms that looked more like police reports than HOA paperwork. When I asked him about the electrical work I was doing on a neighbor's house, he started asking questions that showed he understood electrical theory better than most apprentices I'd worked with. How does a 25-year-old kid know about load calculations and circuit protection without any formal training? That evening, Diana asked me about my day while she was on one of her mysterious phone calls. She stepped outside to finish the conversation, and I could hear her through the window using phrases like documentation protocols and evidence collection standards. When I asked her about it later, she claimed it was just a client who needed help with some tax compliance issues. But here's the thing. What bookkeeper talks about evidence collection? Diana had always been thorough in her work, but lately she'd been researching everything like a professional investigator. She asked detailed questions about HOA legal procedures, property rights, municipal authority, stuff that seemed way beyond what she'd need for bookkeeping clients. The neighbors filled me in on Patricia's track record over dinner at the local diner. Apparently, she'd cleaned up the neighborhood by forcing out 4 families since becoming HOA president. All of them had owned prime corner lots, and all of them had faced the same escalating harassment that was just beginning for me. The first official fine arrived 3 days later, $500, plus a formal compliance hearing scheduled for the following week. Patricia's procedures showed extensive legal knowledge and resources that went way beyond typical HOA complaints. This wasn't some neighborhood busybody with too much time on her hands. This was someone who knew exactly how to weaponize bureaucracy, and she was aiming it directly at me. That night, I caught Diana on another phone call, and what I overheard made my blood run cold. She was talking to someone using tactical language. Copy that. Surveillance target is becoming suspicious of operational security. When she noticed me listening, she quickly hung up and claimed it was just a client call about tax compliance. I confronted her about the strange phone calls and her mysterious expertise in legal procedures. Diana got defensive, which wasn't like her at all. She insisted everything was normal, but I could see something flickering behind her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear? As I watched Brad working in our yard the next morning, documenting another imaginary violation, I couldn't shake the feeling that my entire world was built on lies. This kid moved exactly like me, understood electrical theory without training, and was exactly 25 years old. Diana talked like a federal agent instead of a bookkeeper. What the hell was really happening here? 4 families were forced out in 18 months, all from the most valuable corner lots in the neighborhood. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern, and I was starting to see it clearly. After my first encounter with Patricia's professional-level harassment, I decided to do some digging of my own. What I found made my stomach drop, like I'd just discovered I was living next door to a criminal enterprise. Each family that Patricia had targeted faced identical sequences of harassment. First the violations, then the fines, then the legal battles, and finally the forced sales. All of them had owned large properties with potential value, and all of them had been systematically destroyed by someone who clearly knew how to work the system. Patricia organized what she called a community safety meeting the following week, and let me tell you, it was like watching a masterclass in psychological warfare. She positioned me as a threat to neighborhood values, suggesting that my electrical contracting business brought undesirable elements to their quiet suburban paradise. The way she manipulated the room was terrifying. She had talking points prepared, slides with professionally produced graphics, and she knew exactly which neighbors would support her cause. By the end of the meeting, half the neighborhood looked at me like I was personally responsible for every crime that had ever happened in suburbia. This wasn't just some angry HOA president. This was someone who'd been trained in manipulation tactics. But it was what happened after the meeting that really opened my eyes to how deep this conspiracy went. Patricia had hired a private investigator to follow Diana and me around town, and when we spotted the surveillance car, Diana's reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen from my bookkeeper wife. Instead of getting scared or confused like a normal person would, she immediately shifted into what I can only describe as tactical mode. She checked our mirrors, took an evasive route home, and when the surveillance car tried to keep up with us, she executed a series of defensive driving maneuvers that would make a stunt driver jealous. Then, without thinking, she grabbed her phone and said, "Target has visual on our position. Recommend evasive protocol." I stared at her in complete shock. "Diana, what the hell was that? And who were you talking to?" She caught herself immediately, claiming she'd been talking to a client about avoiding tax audits, but the damage was already done. What kind of bookkeeper knows evasive protocols? What kind of tax consultant talks about targets and surveillance positions? My wife had just demonstrated training that you don't get from community college accounting courses. She'd reacted to being followed like someone who'd been in this situation before, many times. The way she'd handled that car chase wasn't panic. It was muscle memory from professional training. The vacant properties investigation yielded even more disturbing information. I visited all 4 houses that had been abandoned after Patricia's harassment campaigns, and the similarities were terrifying. Each property showed the same violation patterns, the same escalation sequences, and the same legal procedures that had eventually forced the families to sell at below-market prices. The paperwork I found in one of the abandoned mailboxes showed that Patricia had connections to real estate agents, city inspectors, and legal firms that specialized in property acquisition. This wasn't random harassment. This was an organized operation designed to steal valuable real estate through systematic intimidation. Diana's behavior became even more suspicious as the week progressed. She started asking questions about Patricia's background that went way beyond casual curiosity. She wanted to know about financial records, property acquisitions, legal connections, and business partnerships. When I asked why she needed all this information, she claimed she was just trying to help me understand what we were up against. But the way she organized her research, the terminology she used, and the systematic approach she took to gathering intelligence looked nothing like bookkeeping and everything like a federal investigation. She was building a case against Patricia Williams, but why would a freelance bookkeeper know how to do that? The breakthrough came when I noticed something that Patricia had tried to hide. Her maiden name, buried in old HOA documents, was Morrison. That name triggered something in my memory. Not quite a full recollection, but a nagging sense that I'd heard it before in an important context. When I mentioned it to Diana, she got that same guilty look in her eyes that I'd been seeing more and more often. She quickly changed the subject, but I could tell she was hiding something significant. The pieces of this puzzle were starting to form a picture, and I didn't like what I was seeing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Diana's strange expertise and Brad's unsettling familiarity. When I finally drifted off, I had vivid dreams about a young woman I'd known 26 years ago, someone named Janet, though I couldn't quite place her face. The dream felt important, like my subconscious was trying to tell me something, but every time I tried to focus on the details, they slipped away like smoke. All I could remember was that she'd been young, maybe 18 or 19, and that our time together had been brief but intense. After another humiliating encounter with Patricia and her professional harassment machine, I decided to do some eavesdropping of my own. What I overheard made my blood freeze in my veins. Patricia was whispering to Brad about adoption papers in her safe that would prove everything about his real father. When Brad's face went pale and he started to ask if she meant what he thought she meant, Patricia cut him off but confirmed that the DNA doesn't lie. I was hidden close enough to hear every word, and the implications hit me like a freight train. Patricia just mentioned DNA tests and adoption papers that would prove everything about Brad's real father. As I stood there in the shadows, listening to this conversation that felt like it was rearranging my entire understanding of reality, one thought kept pounding in my head. What if my worst fear was actually true? What if this 25-year-old kid who moved exactly like me, who understood electrical theory without training, who had the same stubborn chin and hand gestures, what if he really was my son? The memory fragments from my dreams suddenly started clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been unconsciously trying to solve for months. 26 years ago, when I was just 19, I had a brief but intense relationship with a young woman named Janet Morrison. She was 18, beautiful, and we'd met at a community college party that I barely remembered until this moment. Our relationship had lasted only a few weeks, but it had been passionate and complicated in the way that only teenage relationships can be. Then suddenly, she disappeared from my life without explanation. I'd tried to contact her, but her friends said she'd moved away to live with family in another state. I never heard from her again, and eventually, I moved on with my life. But what if Janet Morrison had been pregnant? What if she'd never told me because she was scared, or her family had convinced her not to? The confrontation happened 3 days later, and it changed everything I thought I knew about my life. I'd been watching Patricia's house, trying to work up the courage to ask her directly about the adoption papers she'd mentioned. When I saw her coming out with a folder of legal documents, I knew this was my chance. "Patricia, we need to talk about Brad," I said, blocking her path to the car. She looked at me with that familiar hatred, but this time there was something else in her eyes. Fear. "I don't know what you think you know, Marcus Thompson, but you're wrong about everything." But as she tried to push past me, the folder slipped from her hands, and medical documents scattered across her driveway. I see my name before she could stop me. There it was, in black and white on official letterhead, biological father, Marcus Thompson, probability 99.97%. The DNA paternity test was dated just 2 years ago, right after her husband Richard Williams had died. Below that was an adoption certificate showing that Patricia Williams had legally adopted Brad Morrison Williams when he was 3 years old, after his mother, Janet Morrison Williams, had died in a car accident. My hands were shaking as I picked up the papers, and Patricia was desperately trying to snatch them back, but the truth was already burned into my brain. Brad wasn't Patricia's biological son. He was mine. "You abandoned him before he was even born," Patricia hissed, her composure finally cracking completely. "Janet was 19 and pregnant, and you disappeared like every other selfish man who can't handle responsibility. She died because she was fleeing from the shame of what you'd done to her, driving through a snowstorm to get away from the memories. Richard and I raised your son as our own, and he never knew the truth about his worthless biological father." The venom in her voice was absolute, but I could also hear the pain underneath. This woman had spent 22 years believing Brad was her husband's biological child, only to discover after Richard's death that the son they'd loved and raised belonged to someone else entirely. Brad appeared around the corner just as Patricia was explaining how much she hated me for existing. The look on his face when he saw the scattered medical documents was heartbreaking. Confusion, betrayal, and dawning realization all mixed together in the expression of someone whose entire identity had just been shattered. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is Marcus Thompson really my biological father?" Patricia's face crumpled as she nodded, and I watched 25 years of family loyalty collapse in a single moment. This kid had been helping Patricia destroy me for months without knowing he was attacking his own biological father. The conversation that followed was the most emotionally devastating of my entire life. Brad wanted to know why I had abandoned him and his mother, and I had to explain that I'd never even known Janet was pregnant. If I'd known about him, I would have been there. I would have supported Janet through the pregnancy, helped raise him, been the father he deserved instead of the absent stranger he'd grown up wondering about. But Janet had made the decision to disappear without telling me about the baby, and by the time she died 3 years later, I had no idea I'd lost both the mother of my child and my chance to know my son during his early years. Patricia's motivation became crystal clear as she stood there watching us try to connect across 25 years of separation. She blamed me not just for existing, but for stealing what she saw as Richard's biological legacy. Richard Williams had loved and raised Brad as his own son, never knowing the truth about his parentage. To Patricia, I represented the ultimate betrayal of her marriage, proof that the family she'd built was founded on a deception she'd never suspected. She saw me as the enemy who had unknowingly robbed her husband of his biological fatherhood. As we stood there in her driveway, surrounded by the scattered evidence of family secrets and genetic truths, Brad made a decision that would change everything. "I want to help you," he said quietly, looking directly at me. "But Patricia raised me, and I can't just abandon her, even if she lied about everything." Then he pulled out something that made my blood run cold. A surveillance photograph showing Diana meeting with men in dark suits next to black SUVs with government license plates. "There's something else you need to know about the woman you think is your wife. What do you think this means? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was living a double life? Share your story in the comments below." Brad just showed me a surveillance photograph of my wife meeting with federal agents. And honestly, I thought my brain might actually explode from trying to process all the revelations hitting me at once. First, I discover I have a 25-year-old biological son who's been helping destroy my life. And now, there's evidence that Diana has been secretly meeting with government agents. The photograph was crystal clear. Diana shaking hands with men in dark suits next to black SUVs, the kind of vehicles that scream federal law enforcement. Brad's revelation about my wife's secret life was about to get buried under an even bigger bombshell. The discovery of exactly why Patricia Williams was so desperate to force me off my grandfather's property. Following Brad's hint about valuable resources under my inherited land, I decided to investigate the geological survey equipment that had been appearing around my property for months. What I found hidden behind the utility shed made my inheritance suddenly make terrifying sense. The geological survey report was comprehensive, professional, and absolutely stunning in its implications. Significant natural gas deposits located at depths of 800 to 1,200 feet. Estimated commercial value, $15 to $18 million. Property designation, Thompson Family Trust, inherited from Howard Thompson, $15 million. The number kept echoing in my head as I realized why Patricia Williams had declared war on a man she'd never met. The survey had been conducted by Morrison Geological Consulting, Patricia's family company, using her maiden name to hide the connection. She'd been systematically mapping my grandfather's property for over 18 months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The plan was diabolically simple. Use her position as HOA president to create escalating violations and harassment, force me to sell the property at below market value before the gas deposit discovery became public knowledge, then quietly develop the mineral rights through her geological consulting business. She'd done this before. All four families she'd driven out of the neighborhood had owned properties with valuable subsurface resources. When I confronted Patricia about her family's geological business, she didn't even bother denying it anymore. "That deposit rightfully belongs to someone with real family connections to this community," she said, her mask of HOA president civility finally dropping completely. "Richard's memory deserves that inheritance, not some outsider who abandoned his own son and inherited property he never earned." The twisted logic was breathtaking. She genuinely believed that stealing my mineral rights would somehow honor her dead husband's memory and compensate for the biological betrayal she felt I had committed. The criminal conspiracy was far more sophisticated than simple property theft. Patricia had systematically corrupted city inspectors, real estate agents, and legal officials to support her harassment campaigns. She had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in professional equipment, legal teams, and private investigators to create an unstoppable machine for forcing property sales. The previous four families had been chosen specifically because Morrison Geological Surveys had identified valuable resources on their land: water rights worth millions, development potential for luxury housing, mineral deposits that could fund retirement fortunes. This wasn't random HOA harassment. This was organized crime disguised as suburban bureaucracy. Diana's reaction to learning about the $15 million gas deposit was unlike anything I'd expected from a supportive wife. Instead of celebrating our sudden wealth or discussing how we might develop the mineral rights responsibly, She immediately shifted into documentation mode. She photographed every page of the geological survey, took detailed notes about Patricia's criminal conspiracy, and asked pointed questions about federal asset forfeiture laws and interstate fraud statutes. When I pointed out that this seemed like strange behavior for a bookkeeper, she claimed she was just being thorough about protecting our interests. But her expertise in mineral rights law and federal property seizure procedures was far beyond what any tax professional would need to know. Brad was facing an impossible moral crisis that I couldn't help him navigate. On one hand, Patricia was the only mother he'd ever known, the woman who had raised him after his biological mother died. On the other hand, he was watching her systematically destroy his biological father and steal an inheritance that legally belonged to him as much as to me. When Patricia discovered that Brad had shown me the surveillance photos of Diana, she threatened to disown him completely if he continued helping me. "You can choose between loyalty to the family that raised you and betrayal of everything I taught you about right and wrong," she told him. The emotional manipulation was vicious and effective. The stakes escalated dramatically when Patricia realized that her geological survey secret was out, and her timeline for stealing the property was collapsing. She'd already invested too much money and committed too many crimes to back down now. The anonymous tips to police about my supposedly unlicensed electrical work, tax evasion, and business fraud were just the beginning of her new strategy. She was planning to plant evidence during a fake federal raid that would trigger real asset forfeiture proceedings against my property. If she couldn't steal the mineral rights through harassment and forced sale, she'd frame me for federal crimes that would result in government seizure of everything I owned. The plan was already in motion by the time I understood what was happening. Patricia had hired professional criminals with military training to impersonate federal agents during the evidence planting operation. They would discover contraband, stolen property, and illegal weapons that would justify seizing my house and land under federal forfeiture laws. The local officials she'd corrupted would ensure that the investigation proceeded smoothly, and Morrison Geological would quietly acquire the mineral rights when the government auctioned the confiscated property. It was a perfect crime, except for one thing she hadn't counted on. Diana received a phone call that night that changed everything. I heard her talking in urgent, frightened tones. "All units, operation is compromised. Subject: Patricia Williams has hired professional criminals armed with military weapons. Fake federal agents en route to your location in 20 minutes. If you blow your cover now, everyone dies." When she hung up and saw me staring at her in complete shock, the fear in her eyes was absolutely genuine. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." But it was too late to run. The fake federal agents were already surrounding our house, and whatever game Diana had been playing was about to explode in all our faces. Diana's taking legal notes instead of helping me process discovering I have a 25-year-old son, and that behavior finally makes sense now that I know she's been living a double life. After months of watching my bookkeeper wife demonstrate suspicious expertise in federal law, tactical communication, and criminal investigation procedures, the truth was about to destroy what I thought was my marriage. When I confronted her about the phone call where she'd mentioned all units and compromised operations, Diana realized her cover was blown, and there was no point in pretending anymore. What she told me next rearranged my understanding of everything that had been happening since we moved to Oakmont Ridge. "I'm FBI Financial Crimes Division," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I've been investigating Patricia Williams and her criminal network for 2 years. The marriage started as a deep cover surveillance assignment, but Marcus, I swear to you, what we have become is real." The words hit me like physical blows as I tried to process the magnitude of her deception. Every intimate conversation we'd had, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared, every time I'd trusted her with my fears and dreams, all of it had potentially been evidence gathering for a federal case. My wife was a trained federal agent who had married me as part of an undercover operation. The scope of Patricia's criminal network was staggering when Diana finally revealed the full investigation. 47 families across 15 states had been systematically targeted and robbed of their property through the same harassment tactics Patricia had used against me. The total fraud value was $38 million, involving insurance fraud, mortgage fraud, identity theft, and corruption of local officials in dozens of communities. Patricia Williams wasn't just a psychotic HOA president. She was the mastermind of one of the largest property theft networks the FBI had ever investigated. Morrison Geological Consulting was just the front company for an organized crime operation that had been destroying families for over a decade. Diana's assignment had started 18 months ago, when the FBI realized Patricia was personally targeting me outside her normal criminal patterns. Most of Patricia's victims were chosen randomly based on property value surveys, but my case showed clear evidence of a personal vendetta that didn't fit the usual profile. The Bureau suspected there was an emotional component driving Patricia's obsession with my specific property, so they assigned Diana to establish deep surveillance through a romantic relationship. What they hadn't anticipated was that Diana would genuinely fall in love with her assignment target, creating an ethical nightmare that was tearing her apart professionally and personally. The revelation that my entire marriage had started as a federal investigation was devastating, but what Diana told me next made it even worse. The gas deposit discovery wasn't accidental, Marcus. We've known about the mineral rights for months through our financial investigation of Morrison Geological. We've been allowing Patricia's harassment to continue because we needed documented evidence of the complete criminal conspiracy. Every violation notice, every illegal fine, every moment of community humiliation I'd endured, the FBI had been watching it all happen, using my suffering as bait to build their case against Patricia's network. Brad's decision to cooperate with federal investigators was the breakthrough the FBI had been waiting for. He'd agreed to wear recording devices to document Patricia's criminal planning in exchange for immunity from prosecution and placement in the Federal Witness Protection Program. The young man who'd spent months helping Patricia destroy his biological father was now risking everything to bring down the only mother he'd ever known. Diana showed me the wire recordings where Patricia explicitly discussed hiring professional criminals to impersonate federal agents, plant evidence in my house, and frame me for crimes that would result in property forfeiture. The federal strategy required allowing Patricia's fake police raid to proceed, while FBI agents documented the entire criminal conspiracy in real time. It was dangerous. The criminals Patricia had hired were military-trained professionals with real weapons who wouldn't hesitate to harm anyone who threatened their operation. But it was also the only way to gather enough evidence to prosecute the entire network and save the dozens of families who were still being targeted by Patricia's organization. Diana's job was to maintain her cover until the last possible moment, then identify herself as federal law enforcement to make the arrests. "I need you to understand something," Diana said, her hands shaking as she held mine. "This assignment was supposed to be routine surveillance for 6 months. I wasn't supposed to fall in love with you. I wasn't supposed to care about your pain when Patricia was destroying your life. And I definitely wasn't supposed to discover that you had a biological son who was being manipulated by the woman I was investigating." The personal complications had made her job almost impossible. She was torn between her professional obligation to build the biggest case of her career and her genuine desire to protect the man she'd married under false pretenses. Patricia's desperation was reaching dangerous levels as she realized the FBI investigation was closing in around her. She'd discovered Brad's cooperation through surveillance equipment she'd installed in his car, and her response was violently unhinged. Diana showed me recordings where Patricia threatened to harm both Brad and me rather than face federal prison, suggesting she was planning a murder-suicide scenario if the fake raid went wrong. The woman who had spent months systematically destroying my life was now prepared to end it rather than accept the consequences of her criminal choices. The community corruption Patricia had orchestrated was staggering in its scope and sophistication. She'd bought off city inspectors, real estate agents, police contacts, and municipal officials in dozens of jurisdictions. The FBI investigation had uncovered bribes, kickbacks, and blackmail schemes that had compromised entire local governments. Oakmont Ridge wasn't just dealing with a corrupt HOA president. We were living in a community where the fundamental institutions of law and order had been purchased by organized criminals who specialized in stealing people's home and life savings. As Diana explained the final phases of the federal operation, I had to make an impossible choice between protecting my biological son from psychological trauma and supporting an investigation that would save dozens of future victims. The fake raid would be terrifying and potentially deadly, but it was also the only way to expose Patricia's network and bring justice to all the families she'd destroyed. Brad would have to maintain his cover until the very end, pretending to help the fake agents while actually leading them into an FBI trap. Diana's phone rang at exactly midnight, with the call we'd been dreading. Armed subjects en route with military-grade weapons. Subject Patricia Williams is showing signs of a complete psychological breakdown. All federal units prepare for potentially lethal engagement. As I looked at my FBI wife and thought about my biological son who was about to help expose his adoptive mother's criminal network, I realized that tomorrow would either bring justice for dozens of families or end with all of us dead. Professional criminals in federal uniforms were breaking down my door while my neighborhood filmed my life being destroyed, and despite knowing this was an FBI operation, the terror felt absolutely real. The sound of splintering wood and shouted commands filled my house as military-trained criminals wearing authentic federal agent gear stormed through my front door with tactical equipment. They were screaming about federal search warrants and drug trafficking charges while my neighbors gathered on their porches to watch what they thought was a legitimate law enforcement operation. Patricia Williams stood in my front yard, playing her role as the concerned HOA president who discovered major criminal activity, telling everyone who would listen that she'd cooperated with federal investigators to protect neighborhood safety. The evidence-planting operation was professionally executed with the kind of precision that only comes from extensive criminal experience. These weren't random thugs Patricia had hired. They were former military specialists who knew exactly how to make planted evidence look authentic. They discovered bags of contraband hidden in my electrical equipment, boxes of stolen electronics in my garage, and illegal weapons that Brad had been forced to place throughout my house earlier that morning. The setup was designed to trigger federal asset forfeiture proceedings that would allow the government to seize my property, after which Morrison Geological would quietly acquire the mineral rights when the land was auctioned. Even though Diana had warned me about the fake raid, having armed criminals in my house felt like I was about to die. These men were carrying real weapons, shouting real threats, and treating me like a genuine federal fugitive who might resist arrest. The adrenaline flooding my system didn't care that this was supposed to be a theater. My body was responding to immediate physical danger from people who could actually harm me if something went wrong. When they slammed me against the wall and started reading charges that could send me to federal prison for decades, the fear was as real as anything I'd ever experienced. My neighbors were recording everything, which meant my reputation was being destroyed in real time, regardless of how this operation ended. Brad's final moment of moral choice came when the fake agents ordered him to help them locate the planted evidence. For months, he'd been torn between loyalty to Patricia and the growing realization that she was using him to destroy his biological father. As he stood there watching armed criminals search my house for evidence he'd been forced to plant, something inside him finally snapped. Instead of following Patricia's orders, he pulled out the FBI recording device he'd been wearing and announced to the fake agents that everything they'd done had been captured on federal surveillance. 25 years of family loyalty ended in that single moment when my son chose truth over the woman who'd raised him on lies. Diana's federal reveal was the most dramatic moment of my entire life. After the fake arrest had proceeded long enough to document the complete criminal conspiracy, my bookkeeper wife produced FBI credentials that transformed her from victim to authority figure in seconds. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, she announced, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of law enforcement command. You're all under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, impersonating federal officers, and racketeering. The confusion on the fake agents' faces was priceless as they realized they'd walked directly into a federal trap that had been 2 years in the making. Real FBI agents emerged from surveillance positions throughout the neighborhood, like something out of an action movie. They'd been hiding in unmarked vehicles, empty houses, and even underground positions, waiting for Diana's signal to make the coordinated arrests. The tactical teams moved with precision that made the fake agents' military training look amateur by comparison. Within minutes, they'd secured all the criminals, Patricia Williams, and several other network associates who'd been watching the operation from various locations around Oakmont Ridge. My neighbors went from filming what they thought was my arrest to witnessing a major federal law enforcement operation unfolding in their suburban community. Patricia's complete psychological breakdown was both terrifying and pathetic to witness. When she realized that Brad had betrayed her and the FBI had captured her entire criminal network, she suffered what can only be described as a complete break from reality. She started screaming about betrayal and family loyalty while FBI agents read her rights for crimes spanning multiple decades and 15 states. The woman who'd spent months systematically destroying my life with cold calculation was now sobbing and ranting like someone who'd lost all connection to sanity. News crews had arrived and were filming her mental collapse as she was loaded into a federal transport vehicle. The public vindication was everything I'd dreamed of during the months of harassment and community isolation. FBI agents displayed the planted evidence, showed the forged federal warrants, and played wire recordings of Patricia's criminal conspiracy while my neighbors listened in shocked silence. The same people who'd voted to enhance monitoring of my property were now learning that their HOA president was a federal criminal who'd corrupted their local government and stolen millions of dollars from families across 15 states. Every violation notice, every fine, every moment of public humiliation I'd endured was now exposed as part of an organized crime operation that had been documented by federal investigators. The scope of Patricia's criminal network was staggering when the FBI finally revealed the complete investigation results. 47 families, 15 states, $38 million in total fraud, and all of it coordinated from a suburban HOA office in Oakmont Ridge. The simultaneous arrests were happening nationwide as FBI field offices rounded up real estate agents, city inspectors, legal professionals, and other network associates who had been part of the property theft conspiracy. Patricia Williams hadn't just been a local criminal, she'd been the mastermind of one of the largest domestic fraud operations in federal law enforcement history. The final act of violence came when Patricia attempted to attack Brad with a concealed knife during her federal arrest. Even in restraints and surrounded by FBI agents, she was so consumed with rage at her son's betrayal that she tried to stab him in front of news cameras and dozens of witnesses. The additional assault charges were just the final entries on a criminal indictment that would ensure she spent the rest of her life in federal prison. As I watched my son dodge the knife attack from the woman who had raised him, I realized that Patricia's hatred had finally consumed whatever maternal love she might have once felt. As the FBI wrapped up their evidence collection and began transporting prisoners, something unexpected happened that made my stomach drop. FBI agents started asking Diana questions about financial records they'd discovered that suggested connections to international money laundering operations. Patricia's network hadn't just been stealing properties. They'd been washing money for criminal organizations that spanned multiple countries. The $15 million gas deposit was just the beginning of a criminal enterprise that reached into areas the FBI was still investigating. The FBI supervisor approached me with news that changed everything about my future. Mr. Thompson, Patricia Williams's criminal network was bigger than we initially realized. The gas deposit was just the beginning. We found evidence of a $50 million money laundering operation involving international criminals. You and your son are now federal witnesses in ongoing investigations. But there's something else we need to discuss. We have reason to believe Patricia has associates still operating who might try to finish what she started. As I looked at my son and my FBI wife, I realized that our victory over Patricia Williams might have just painted targets on our backs. What would you do if you suddenly inherited millions but had to live in fear for the rest of your life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. 6 months later, Patricia Williams received a 25-year federal prison sentence, but the victory felt hollow when I considered what we'd discovered about her international criminal connections. The FBI had dismantled her domestic property theft network, with 67 arrests nationwide, but the investigation into money laundering and international organized crime was still ongoing. Patricia's operation had been far more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. She'd been washing money for criminal organizations in 12 countries, while using property theft profits to fund even larger criminal enterprises. The $15 million gas deposit that had started this whole nightmare was just one small piece of a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The financial justice was life-changing, even though it came with complications that normal lottery winners never have to consider. I received federal restitution payments, plus full development rights to the natural gas lease, which was valued at $15 million over the next 20 years. But accessing that wealth required constant coordination with federal marshals who were monitoring threats from Patricia's international associates. Every business transaction, every investment decision, every major purchase had to be cleared through federal security protocols designed to protect witnesses in ongoing criminal investigations. Having $15 million doesn't mean much when you can't spend it without potentially triggering retaliation from international criminals. Brad's relationship with me was healing slowly, but the psychological damage from discovering 25 years of family deception couldn't be fixed overnight. He'd moved into my house after Patricia's arrest, and we were building a genuine father-son relationship for the first time in his life. The gas lease money funded his engineering degree and therapy sessions to help him process the trauma of learning that everything he'd believed about his identity and family history had been built on lies. We were working together in my electrical contracting business, and I was teaching him the trade that seemed to come naturally to him through genetic inheritance. But there were still days when he looked at me with confusion and pain, wondering what his life might have been like if Janet had told me about her pregnancy 26 years ago. Diana's choice to stay married to me, despite the circumstances of our relationship, was both surprising and complicated. The marriage had started as a federal operation, but the feelings that developed during her undercover assignment were genuine. She'd transferred to the local FBI field office and was specializing in fraud victim advocacy, helping other families recover from criminal networks like Patricia's. Our relationship required extensive couples therapy and complete transparency about her professional obligations, but we were making it work. The trust issues were enormous. Every conversation we'd had during our first year of marriage had potentially been evidence gathering, but we'd decided that what we'd built together was worth fighting for. The community transformation in Oakmont Ridge was dramatic and necessary after the exposure of how completely Patricia had corrupted local institutions. The HOA was dissolved and replaced with federal oversight procedures designed to prevent future organized crime infiltration. I was elected to the Community Improvement Board with unanimous support from neighbors who'd spent months thinking I was a criminal threat to their safety. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who'd voted to enhance monitoring of my property were now asking me to help rebuild trust in local governance. We were implementing transparency requirements and background checks that would hopefully prevent another Patricia Williams from taking control of our community. My electrical contracting business expanded statewide with a specialization that I'd never expected, helping fraud victims rebuild their homes and lives. The FBI connected me with dozens of families who had been targeted by Patricia's network, and Thompson Electrical became the company they trusted to repair the damage done by criminal harassment campaigns. Brad was learning the trade while completing his engineering degree, and we were building something positive from the destruction Patricia had tried to inflict on our family. There was something deeply satisfying about using the skills she'd tried to destroy to help other people recover from her criminal network. The media attention brought congressional hearings on HOA reform and suburban organized crime that I'd never expected to be part of. I testified before Congress about property theft networks and how easily criminal organizations could infiltrate suburban communities. The story had become a national symbol of justice, prevailing over organized crime, but it had also made Brad and me recognizable faces in ongoing federal investigations. Our security situation was complex. We were protected witnesses who were also public figures in a case that had international implications. Today, as Brad and I install solar electric